welcome to Night Clerk Radio. I'm Ross, and with me, as always, is my co-host Burke, and this is episode 14, Introduction to Dream Catalogue and Dreampunk, a examination of the record label Dream Catalogue, the genre that is Dreampunk, or marketing term, or what does it even mean to label a music as being a genre? Let's deconstruct it a bit. And of course, the record label owner, HKE / Hong Kong Express / many other aliases over the last 5 years. So who can say how many? Yeah, so Dream Catalogue is one of the larger, maybe the largest sort of record label directly arising from the vaporwave scene. It was created in 2015 by HKE, formerly Hong Kong Express. That was probably his most popular name, nom de plume. But in the last 5 years, HKE has tried to, we'll get into his sort of, outspokenness in a bit, but he's trying to create this new term, Dreampunk, to describe the music that he makes and that the artists he curates make. So we'll kind of look at what he's trying to go after, what they're trying to go after, and we of course pick 2 albums from the record label to talk about. But Burke, you have thoughts on this?
Oh, I do. Okay, yeah, we can do genre thoughts. We also do want to discuss some of HKE's hot takes. Like it's like an experimental way of making vaporwave by boiling water with hot takes. I don't know. There's a Steam joke in there somewhere. I should have written it before we hit record. Anyway, yeah. So you mentioned that he is very against the term vaporwave, and all the stuff they release now is sort of retagged as Dreampunk. That's like the big term, but he's come up with or uses other terms as well, like hard vapor for some of his techno, hard house kind of influence music. Although some people think hard vapor is sort of a joke. And then one of his artists that we're reviewing today uses intral vapeur, which is a French word for steamer because they're a French artist. There's a few others, but yeah, the Dreampunk is the big thing. That's what his whole manifesto kind of, I have some quotes from him that kind of like what he wants it to be, like his sort of artist statement about it. But yeah, so he doesn't like being called a vaporwave artist, even though he uses vaporwave producers and YouTube channels. Like he's worked with Vapor Memory, who is a very prolific YouTube channel that uploads a lot of vaporwave albums. That's where a lot of this music can be found and easily listenable to if it's not on Bandcamp or if you don't want to download anything. So, I've said this before on previous episodes, but just, hi, if you're a new listener, I'm not really like a genre essentialist in some sense. Like I understand that there's like a human need to kind of categorize things. And sometimes once a genre is around long enough, it gets further and further subdivided. I think I just sort of am tired of things being punk. Okay. Yeah. Honestly, a big part of it, all cyberpunk and all the derivatives. Because to me, punk is a very specific ethos of, anti-authoritarianism, DIY, anti-consumerism, et cetera, et cetera. And, maybe they fit in with that. But I think it's sort of just been corrupted into a marketing term where cyberpunk is now just like, wow, cool robots. Maybe because we now live in the cyberpunk world. So it's we're a little detached from warning people about corporations taking over everything. Yeah. So I don't know what Dreampunk is. Is it like, is it the aesthetic of some set of rebellion? I don't know. I just think if you look at like punk as a genre, as soon as punk started to evolve out of its roots, I think the most applicable term was post-punk, which arose in the 70s. And that was like, we really like a lot of the punk aesthetic, the punk ethic, but we want to move beyond what we see as like its primitive roots. And that's sort of what moved into like Susie and the Banshees and Joy Division and, eventually like the Cure and Talking Heads in terms of taking those aesthetics and blending them with more technique and a little more, I don't know, academic sensibilities or just thinking about what you're doing a little bit more. So I think like if you follow that template, post vaporwave is, in my opinion, the best term for what people are doing right now. I can follow that. I think that's a better way of describing it, because if you're thinking about vaporwave as the music that was made from like 2008, 2013, 14, the prime era of it, the floral shops and what have you, it had very sort of, I wouldn't say super rigid rules, but there were rules. It was very sample based, very plunderphonics based. It was very
picking, elevator music and sort of deconstructing it. And it like had a very specific ethos. And we've gone beyond that now. There's so much more that's sort of inspired and sort of a continuation of that, musical conversation. But people aren't just repeating the same things that were popular 8 years ago. God, it was like 8 years ago.
Yeah. I do agree that the genre has evolved.
Mhm.
And I think if you were to try to do, I mean, you can't for a lot of reasons,
Mhm.
but I think if a new album came out that was just 70s rock samples or disco samples slowed down, it would just feel dated. There's just so much like good original composition that also blends in light sampling or different types of vocal sampling, which we can talk about with one of these albums later.
Mhm.
I don't know. Dreampunk just doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I mean, even plunderphonics based albums can be like use more sophisticated techniques and methods of deconstruction. I mean, look at The Caretaker, for example. Like, there's so much you can do with plunderphonics beyond just pitch shifting it and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, exactly.
I would use the term to describe what the Dream Catalogue vibe. They're going for a very specific image and aesthetic that is one of the most popular post vaporwave albums or vaporwave albums out there is 2814 Birth of a New Day, which is a collaboration between HKE and Telepath. If you look at the album art on it and you listen to it, that's the template. That's the model of what Dream Catalogue is trying to achieve, and just like, variations on a theme and sort of building upon that. We're not reviewing that particular album, but if you haven't listened to it, you should definitely listen to it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And you've seen the album art on like memes and stuff like that. It's shorthand for vaporwave to a lot of people. But HKE in 2016 was doing a mix and wrote this little artist statement to describe it. And he said, this is what Dreampunk is. Dreampunk is the music of the cyberpunk age we find ourselves in, prophesized by cyberpunk writers in the 80s. As technology increasingly takes over, the only thing we have left that is sacred and private are our minds. For now, at least. So Dreampunk is the music of the mind, where the main objective is to transport you to another world through suggested narratives and concepts with abstract, futuristic sounding music for a new generation. It's dream music for underground people living in this increasingly surreal dream world reality, which is, I mean, a lot of that you could sort of apply to a lot of vaporwave. So like, it's sort of continuing the conversation. It's in a nutshell, think of like the Vangelis soundtrack for Blade Runner, and building upon that with sort of ambient and drone influences. That's how I describe it if I had like a sentence to describe it.
Okay. See, that's interesting. And reading that quote, I don't totally disagree then with the philosophy of the genre in terms of being so media saturated that there is some novelty to just having a bit of internal privacy for a change. The degree to which you are constantly bombarded by choice or just by virtue of how public spaces are curated these days, you're always consuming something. In some sense. I think I've talked about when I would go grocery shopping, I would put on noise canceling headphones, but not play anything. I just didn't want to hear music and people for 30 minutes.
Sure.
So the idea of being in your own head and at peace with being within your mind and not saturated or overcome by technology is interesting, but then you're trying to achieve that by listening to stuff. So it feels a little weird to me, but I still generally agree. I do like that description of it, even if maybe the word Dreampunk doesn't sit well with me.
I mean, I think he's trying to go with something that is a little different enough from like, bog standard vaporwave that you kind of do need a different term to describe what it's going for. I should note we did review in this regard a Dreampunk album, Dark Pyramid.
Yep.
Dark Pyramid is another one of HKE's aliases. So we've already reviewed HKE before. I can see what you mean about like trying to achieve this goal through music may be sort of counterproductive because you just need silence for that. On the other hand, I really do like a lot of this music.
Yeah, me too.
And if you look at the Dream Catalogue website, you can see they are going for a very specific sort of visual aesthetic too, very lush purples and greens and like highly saturated photoshopped images of dystopian cyberpunk city landscapes and characters that would be in a cyberpunk movie or game or what have you. HKE does know something about marketing, but in some ways I did see on the Vaporwave subreddit, someone compared him as the Kanye of Vaporwave. It's not entirely wrong. Like it's not, there's something there because HKE is a very controversial person in the Vaporwave scene.
Loves to tweet.
He loves to tweet, both on Dream Catalogue and on his own Twitter, Lucid HKE. Among the other things he has advocated for in the past, there should be more gatekeeping in music. Just in general, there should be more elitism and gatekeeping. Way too much shit drowning out the market. Another one is Bandcamp is so much worse than major record labels. He hates the idea of the album as a concept, just albums in general. He does not like Bandcamp, thinks it's too big. Yeah, he also, as I mentioned, pushed hard vapor, which is a genre I don't really care for. I've never really listened to any that I really liked. Have you listened to any hard vapor?
I think the only hard vapor I may have listened to is HKE and Culture. One of the artists today did a series of like parody, goofy art house music.
Oh, was that Blank Goofy thing that you said?
The Blank Goofy Zero, which is more of an HKE project, but they also had Goof House Productions, which was like hard house music, but with goofy sound effects. So yeah, a little make up there. Maybe I haven't listened to much hard vapor outside of the parody stuff.
I don't care for it. A lot of people think that he was just making fun of vaporwave as a concept by sort of promoting this. It's kind of hard vapor in a nutshell, sort of like hard house techno kind of vibe with some gabber kind of thrown in there, Slavic sort of visual imagery, you know, and by that I mean like guys in Adidas tracksuit kind of smoking cigarettes and squatting kind of vibe. But it's kind of hard to tell when he's being serious and when he's just like taking the piss, when he's just like making obvious jokes. And so it's hard to know when to take him seriously, which again makes him sort of problematic at times.
Yeah, I'm reading these hot takes you sent me, and my God. I mean, I'm really happy to see just people dunking on him in the replies. So maybe there's a little bit of sense left in the genre, but I think there needs to be more elitism and gatekeeping in music.
Yeah. It's
I will turn Dream Catalogue into a place of high curation, separate from all the fucking crap. I don't know, man. It took me a while to find an album I wanted to listen to that was relatively new, because a lot of the new stuff was pretty bad, my dude.
Not the only record label I've seen on Bandcamp that has been consistent in any genre period has been Cryo Chamber.
There it is.
Yeah, Cryo Chamber knows what they want, and that's it. And they're very good about that. But there's enough interesting stuff there that if you can find it, it's really good. But like, it took us a while to find our albums too. The thing is, HKE has been, just to list some of his aliases that he has, aside from releasing as HKE, of course, he's also released as Broken HKE. As I mentioned, 2814 Hong Kong Express, some real good bangers on that one when he releases Hong Kong Express, like 2047. And then, of course, the self-titled album, Hong Kong Express. Let's see here. Sand Timer, Dark Pyramid, as I mentioned, Heart Full of Love, the one we reviewed. One I didn't realize, Sub Eris. I've listened to some Sub Eris, and I didn't realize that was also HKE. Buried Angel, Air Japan, Keito Samguchi, Kamokata, City Developer, Something in Cyrillic, Lotus Flowers, Future City Love Stories, Television Experience, Emperor Tangerine, Frequence Sacres, and Adolf. And this is not conclusive. Those are just some of his aliases. The dude likes to put out a lot of music.
Yeah. Thinking about his quotes about genre, I don't completely blame him. I think he's going about it the wrong way. But I do think any sort of mature field runs into the issue of trying to like discuss and criticize that field in the framework of the field itself.
Yeah, how do you innovate in a music genre without leaving the genre? Like, a genre is defined by having these characteristics, and if you go outside of these characteristics too much, what is it?
Yeah, exactly. And everything runs into this. How do you discuss language in the frameworks of language? How do you do math in the framework of like mathematical systems? It's just one of those things where you talk about this low barrier to entry, but look at all the stuff he's put out that you just listed.
And some of it's very good. Some of them, the albums I've liked, but like I couldn't even listen to all of it. Like, he's putting out more than I could even just listen to.
And none of it would be possible without a cheap way to put out music for people to hear. Like you literally can't exist in the own system. Like, you exist because of the system you're. I don't know. It becomes a like, oh, you participate in society, yet criticize it, curious type argument, which I don't want to get into. I just think it's weird to be such an experimental, prolific artist, but then be against other people doing it.
He's just being provocative, but like that keeps people thinking about him, and I guess gets more people to look at his music and the music that he's releasing through Dream Catalogue. So yeah, in the last few months, he's just made a statement where he is basically has this little post on his website where he's talking about how he's going to focus more on promoting other artists rather than just his own music. There's actually a really good YouTube video that he links to, Dreampunk, the soundtrack to Dreams. There's sort of a 15-minute explainer video with the samples and sort of like explaining where Dreampunk is coming from and what are the characteristics of it. So we'll have a link to that video in the show notes. He did this in May, so maybe he'll start finding really great artists in the future. So it'll be interesting to see what this new act, this new stage in his career will bring, whether he's going to like calm down and sort of focus on releasing great music, or if he's still going to be the HKE we all know and love.
Yeah, I feel like that frustration is not sustainable. You have to outgrow that, or you just become an even weirder older man.
Yeah, he's certainly at the point where he's really focused on this as a career and not just like as a hobby. So he kind of does need to, I think, sort of focus on just releasing great music. And, you know, I mean, the Dreampunk thing certainly works for him as a marketing term, is like people know it and associate with him. Although there is, if you look at the Dreampunk tag on Bandcamp, there are other artists who have like, oh, I like this sound, I'm going to make my own album of this Dreampunk sound. And so there's like artists independent of him, of Dream Catalogue, that are releasing their own Dreampunk music. So maybe in future episodes, we'll explore some of that music, but it certainly found a niche.
Absolutely.
But with that, we should sort of dive into our albums.
Would you hold on, please? May I speak to Mr. Sasaki, please? 少々お待ちください。
Okay, so that was a bit from the track Shiny Intelligence off the album New by Culture, where this is vaporwave or post-vaporwave. So Culture is, of course, stylized with V's, and I think actually in some work the E is a sigma. Mm-hmm. So you gotta really stand out. But I'm just gonna say Culture because it's easier. So Culture is a Paris-based vaporwave, post-vaporwave artist, longtime member of the genre. They've been producing music since the early 2010s. Some of the oldest stuff on Bandcamp is from that 2013, 2012 kind of era of early vaporwave. And I picked this album because I just seen Culture, the artist name, in other vaporwave mixes on like YouTube. And I had thought maybe they were one of those artists that just made some stuff in the early 2010s and disappeared. Nope, they're back with a new album. Came out this year. It's on Dream Catalogue, of course, because that's our criteria for picking albums this episode. Culture, not a whole lot about them out there. They've done other collaborations with HKE. I mentioned the Goof House Productions at the beginning, which is like hard vapor parody, I guess. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, going off of Blank Banshee, but with Goofy instead of just digitized face.
Yep. But I really like the aesthetic of a lot of Culture stuff, which makes sense visually because they're, I think, primarily an illustrator and like freelance graphic designer. All the visual stuff is really tight. Yeah, so I found it's 4 years old at this point, but an old Reddit AMA from the Vaporwave subreddit of Culture answering some questions. That's sort of where I learned a lot about them.
Oh, okay.
But they do have sort of a funny story about how they got into Vaporwave, which sort of ties into this last episode. We talked about, you know, people randomly genre tagging stuff and what is the importance of a genre tag. They only found out about Vaporwave because they put up a song on Tumblr and SoundCloud and somebody tagged it as Vaporwave. And they're like, ooh, what the fuck is Vaporwave? And like went and looked into it and then fell in love with the genre.
Nice.
So, hey, you know, maybe that's one in the pro column for letting people tag your music with any genre they want. So what is this album? I loved it. It's super chill. It's all original music, which we can talk about. And just a lot of just great vibes. What did you think about it? I guess I'll hand it off.
Yeah, no, I quite enjoyed it too. There's kind of an interesting division for me, like from the first half to the second half of the album. The first half kind of remind me a bit of like Echo Jams a little bit. Cause yeah, like you mentioned, it is original music, but it does sound sampled and Plutterphonics based, which at least at the beginning, there's a lot of dissonance, a lot of like slight things sounding a bit out of tune, but in an interesting way. And then sort of like in the second half of the album, I was actually reminded a bit of Home, like the artist who did Odyssey and so kind of like a chill wave or synth pop kind of vibe to it. So very listenable, very, I would agree, chill. It's just an interesting journey on this album, and I mean, for a brief album too, it's only like what 28 minutes long, something like that. I think I like the second half of the album more because I'm such a big fan of Home and that sort of chill wave.
Yeah,
I kind of would like to know. There are some samples in it, like the sample at the very end of like this talk radio stuff is like, what is the story behind this? There's a bit of mystery to it.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting vocal sample work on this, which is the bulk of it. So I think we both sort of thought it was maybe more Plunderphonics based than it actually is. But there's all these like sales pitch vocal samples of like 1.2 million square feet of shopping pleasure is like the opening line for the second track, Polished. At least that's what it sounds like they're saying. It's pretty distorted.
Yeah.
There's a lot of your standard sort of what sound like Japanese commercial samples. And then, I want to know, okay, I've written down Access as the best track. It's the last one because it mentioned Star Trek. But yeah, there's some talk show where they're like asking about like Patrick Stewart and Jean-Luc Picard, and then there's rambling about getting in a fight at a high school play, and then ends with somebody doing a Julia Child impression.
Yeah,
I want to know what that's from.
Although you mentioned favorite track, I think "Taste of Paradise" is probably my favorite track. I was getting I'm a huge fan of Koya Naskatsi, the Philip Glass music, and I was getting a vibe of that from that track. It was there's that sort of build up and that kind of like. I don't know. I quite enjoyed that. And the fact that the album ends on that vocal sampling, that talk radio just kind of trailing off without any resolution. It's just kind of like, it almost was like, I would say it's thematic. Like when Godspeed You Black Emperor throws in like, a homeless schizophrenic person ranting about something that's very thematic, but it was almost that same kind of level of like, I'm just going to fuck with you a little bit. I can appreciate that.
I agree. Yeah, it's funny. I should say Access is my favorite track by the Star Trek category. I think my actual favorite musical track is probably Ocean Plastic, which is just like really chill. But there's a lot of interesting stuff overall on this album. So let me play a sample of one of the things that I want to talk about that they do on this album. That little glitchy part was from one of the later tracks, New Brain Facility on this album. This is one of the cool things that you hear throughout this album that I really liked their experimentation with, which is tempo. There's like this weird tempo gradient throughout some songs, not just in terms of feeling like a tape delay or like slowing down a tape to distort it, but actually just the drum you can hear in the drum loops. Yeah, you can hear the BPM changing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very gradual, like this slow gradient of slowly speeding up and slowing down. And other times it's really jumpy, where it'll just within a beat or two, it'll shift really quick. They also do this in the track Servicing. And I think that's cool because that's definitely playing with tempo is something that a group of physical musicians can do. They do it all the time, but it just sounds so different in a DAW in like electronic music context that I really liked it, especially the real jumpy stuff. It almost made me feel like I was fidgety or anxious, that sort of like trying to sit still and then you can't.
It's interesting on the Dream Catalogue website that they categorize this in genres, not as Dreampunk, but like as down tempo and intra vapor. But down tempo, I would not characterize this album really as down tempo. Because they also characterize our next album as down tempo, which is, if these are both down tempo, I don't know what the fuck that term even means anymore.
Just less than like heartbeat stuff is probably what they're thinking of.
I guess. Yeah, I don't know. Again, this whole discussion of genre, like what does it even mean to be this term when you can't even describe it? Yeah, I wouldn't describe this necessarily as peppy or like upbeat, but like it gets you going a little bit. Like it's certainly not music to fall asleep to.
No, it's chill, but I think in like the way chill hop is chill. It's still got a good bit of energy, but it's not aggressive. It's not trying to get you amped up.
Okay, well, actually, looking at our second album, it is characterized as ambient, dreampunk, and drone, not down tempo. I was
okay.
So there's a difference between down tempo and ambient, apparently.
The mystery deepens.
But yeah, it's a fun album. I think Culture was having a lot of fun with this. There's a lot of interesting little moments in this. Using original compositions, but kind of like plunderphonic techniquing or using those techniques on that. I mean, I like that idea. Just having fun with music.
I agree, because there's a lot of I like all of the original stuff on this album, even though I think I like the second half maybe a bit more. I think it's interesting that so much of that original composition still gave me vibes of other stuff. And I don't think that's intentional. I think that's probably me connecting dots that don't exist. But there's so much stuff where I thought like the intro pulsing, like drum bass stuff on the 99XM reminded me of the Harold Faltermeyer like Top Gun intro before the guitar comes in. I know it's not. My ears aren't that bad, but like just when I first heard it sort of just in the background, I was like, wait, oh my God, are we sampling? No, we aren't. Clearly not. And then there's a lot of like little synth chord arpeggio stuff that gave me various like video game vibes. And I think that's because I know that in the past Culture has sampled video game music, like Kondo and stuff from Mario Brothers and other music. There's just some stuff just gave me Mass Effect vibes, which is a compliment.
Nice.
I think it's a very mature vaporwave album. That's what I think of it as. It's vaporwave for 2020s. Maybe it's evolving with us. I don't know what that means. It might mean nothing, but I think like we were talking about, the first round of vaporwave was very obvious in what it's doing. It was very obvious in that tradition of like 80s plunderphonics of cutting up and mangling pop samples to make fun of them in some sense, or to evoke a mood from them. Rather, maybe not make fun of them. That's maybe not the fair way to put it. I think now we've matured to the point where you have these original compositions with some sampling, some plunderphonics that have clear influences, but it's become its own mature genre. Whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, I think it's soothing and awesome, and that people should check it out.
I would agree. So moving on to our second album. That was Sangam. The album is called Mount to Nothing, and that was from the title track, which is about in the middle of the album. This is, as you can tell, a bit different from New. This is a very ambient, sort of ambient drone kind of album, or maybe even dark ambient. This is more, I would categorize as what Dreampunk is about. It is very atmospheric and it is labeled as Dreampunk on the Dream Catalogue website. This was released in 2018, and Sangam has done a lot of, that also has been around for several years, has released quite a few albums. I like this because in a sense it was almost like a Vangelis or like cyberpunk influenced version of the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack, some of the tracks in that. So,
okay.
Especially this particular one, Mount to Nothing, I get a sense of being in rain and being in a dreary, sort of ominous environment. And yeah, it's very lush and well-produced sort of soundscape. So I liked it. This is sort of my jam. Burke, is it your jam as well?
Yeah, I liked it. I think it's interesting. My first thought hearing it was, I picked the Vaporwave album and you picked the Dark Ambient album, which is really the behind-the-scenes clash between your host is Vaporwave versus Dark Ambient.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's sort of funny because I always think of vaporwave stuff, and you're always like, well, I want to talk about dark ambient stuff. Well, you know what? We found an episode where we can do both. So I really liked it. So first of all, I want to talk specifically about the track that you played the sample for, Amount to Nothing, and see if you agree. I actually, when I first heard some of the synths on this, I thought of dungeon synth, like that dungeon ambient vibe. I the synth patching or something about it made me think of the Depressive Silence album we did for the dungeon synth episode.
Yeah.
It just felt like exploring.
I think that's not mutually exclusive with the Silent Hill too, sort of like vibe, because again, like some of those tracks are like meant to be looped infinitely while you're exploring, you know, the foggy town of Silent Hill. And so I guess that's sort of like the appeal of drone. This is categorized as drone as well. And drone is not something I listen to a lot, but like, yeah, that sort of sense of exploration in a dreary environment, things not changing because you're just lost. I can see that. I wasn't actually specifically thinking about that, but in a sense, I was sort of in a similar space.
I think it stood out to me because a lot of the synths on this sound great. There's really good synth patching, like these big, elaborate sort of synth choirs.
Yeah, the
like
choir,
very wide chord voicings with like a really, really good patch. It just sounds so lush. And this one just didn't. In a good way, it just sounded like purposefully different in its production.
Yeah.
To some of the other synth stuff, which sounds great. Like there's so many good influences on this album that I could talk about.
It's interesting, especially because the beginning of the album begins a little like a more faster pace. Like the opening track is See You Never. And let's just play a sample of that. One, you can hear the rain, you can hear a beat, so it's almost like I'm outside a club in a cyberpunk city at night and I can hear the club music from inside. Now they don't use any techniques to specifically evoke that, but like that was kind of the sense I was getting, because the rest of the album isn't as, you know, doesn't have that beat. And the rain does come back in a couple of different tracks. I think that's sort of a very strong evocative sense of place right at the start. Like I remember like A Heart Full of Love sort of had a similar sort of progression of like exploring a space and using rain as sort of a leitmotif.
So remind me, Heart Full of Love had an overall concept of like a worker at an arcology falling in love with an android and then escaping together. That was like a concept album. Yeah. There's a lot of really good establishment of those places throughout that album.
This one is more not as specifically a concept album, but it is kind of evoking these dreary dystopian cityscapes where all hope is being swallowed up by the rain, or being washed away by the rain, really. There's some vocals in it, not just the choir, you know, and the track Cry in the Street. Yeah, it's very much like you want to be in a space in this kind of place without going to sleep yet.
Yeah, Cry in the Street is a really great track that sort of broke me into this album, I would say, because it has a lot of really strong peak Eno vibes to me.
Yeah.
It reminds me a lot of some of his late 70s, early 80s work. And it really made me think about this album because every time I was listening to it, I was sort of zoning out, like in a good way, because it's just a sleepy album to me.
Yeah.
It's a sleepy album. And the tracks that stand out to me are ones that I think trigger something in the back of my brain that reminds me of something else I like and makes me sit up and go, hey, this sounds like another thing I like. I should make a note of that. So it just breaks through that ambient haze, because I really do like drone for precisely that effect of just kind of getting lost in the music and not having to like think about much and just sort of this sensory saturation.
Well, I think the problem with me with drone is that there's a very fine line between a sound you want to hear for a while with minor variations and a sound that irritates the fuck out of you. I don't listen to much drone because when I listen to it, it's just off in a way that I don't like. It's a little too grating. But this isn't. This is like those choirs that you mentioned are like, I love those. I'm a huge sucker for that kind of thing. you're in the Cybral Cathedral lost as you're trying to seek shelter from the rain. That kind of vibe I like, but there's a lot of drone albums out there that just like will use radio sounds or like just kind of grating, irritating sounds that I don't really care for.
My favorite drone that I've mentioned before is Stars of the Lid, which is a Texas duo, but their drone is like symphonic or orchestral drone where it's just a string pieces where you just have long held notes and kind of like a minimal movement with strings and synth. I think you'd like a lot of that stuff. That was my go-to airplane music when I was traveling a lot for work.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be more of a sucker for that kind of music. Yeah, a lot of drone out there gets a little too even aggressive, which I feel is a mistake. They're leaning too hard on the industrial side of things. But this is not industrial at all, even though it's in like city punk Vangelis kind of place. It's foggy and misty and like I get the Silent Hill vibe from it. But I mean, cities are kind of like dungeons if you think about it.
Also, if we're just shouting out influences, which I'm just doing, it's a dark ambient album, so I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that some parts have Lynch vibes for me. I know it's a rule. It's Burke 2020 don't mention Lynch challenge. I have failed. But the track Crushed Thought, which is probably one of my favorite, a lot of Twin Peak Lynch vibes on it. Yeah, he's sort of got two modes of music. He's got the Angelo lush piano music that's all over like Twin Peaks and stuff. But there's also just a lot of this ambient dread music, I kind of call it, where you have these like dark descending chord progressions that are just kind of repeated. So it's just like do 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 do, just like over and over. And man, I love that. That really stood out to me.
Sangam has done a lot of different work. So if you like this album, I would look up some of their other albums. I couldn't find much about the artist myself. I'm pretty sure they've performed live, actually. Did perform live. I mean, nobody's really doing much live performing now, but it's definitely a worthy entry in the genre. And again, this is the kind of thing that Dreampunk is doing or is trying to achieve, even though it's not exactly like, I mean, HKE, I don't think would do an album like this. He has his own aesthetic going on. So if any of this sounds appealing to you, if you're a sucker for exploring a rainy city at night, and maybe you've lost hope or not, this is the album to do that wandering by. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this a little preliminary exploration of Dream Catalogue and their place in the vapor scene, the vapeur, if you will. I'm sure we'll revisit their catalog sooner or later. I mean, at some point we probably do just need to go examine 2814.
Yeah.
And Telepath, or maybe just Telepath, because Telepath does some really good shit too. But our next episode, speaking of dark ambient, we're going to be looking at dark jazz. A lot of people liked Miles to Midnight or, messaged us saying that they started listening to the album after our review. So let's revisit it. Let's see what else is being produced in dark jazz.
Absolutely. And dark jazz is also benefits, much like this episode, from being a genre that I have a lot of thoughts about. We'll be ready to go.
Also, probably going to get to talk about David Lynch again.
Yay!
So, of course, we are at Night Clerk Radio on Twitter. I'm at Ross Payton on Twitter, and Burke is at Burke McBurkinson. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcast or Google Podcasts or whatever podcasting app of choice, and tell your friends and family that you like us. Word of mouth helps a lot. Until next time, stay out there listening to the haunted music that moves you, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.